Once upon a time, there was a poor miller who had 3 sons. When the miller died, he left them everything he had in the world, which wasn't much. To the eldest son, he left his mill. To his second son, he left his donkey. But to the youngest son, all he could leave was a cat. "A cat," said the poor boy. "What good is a cat?" He was very sad. "Now hold on," said the cat. One of the first things you noticed about this cat was that he could talk. "Hold on," he said. "You get me a bag with a string around the top and a pair of boots, and I'll show you that things are not as bad as they appear." That seemed an odd request for a cat, a pair of boots, but this was an odd cat. So the miller's son got Puss a bag, an old laundry bag, I guess, and he scraped together enough money to buy him a little pair of boots. They were shiny black, with red heels and fancy tops, and I can tell you Puss was a proud, high-stepping cat when he put them on. The first thing he did was to take his bag and go out into a field where he knew there were a lot of rabbits. He put some carrots in the bag and spread it out on the ground, and then he lay down beside it and pretended he was dead. Well, you know rabbits. They have no more sense than to fall for a trick like that. Sure enough, one of them came sniffing around the bag, and when he smelled the carrots, he crawled inside after him. Puss just lay there with one eye half open, not making a sound, but inside he was going, and the minute he saw that rabbit's little white tail disappear into the bag, whop! He pounced on it and pulled the string tight. And there he had it. Now, an ordinary cat might have taken the rabbit to a butcher, sold him for a small profit, and been satisfied with that. But not Puss. He was a cat with big ideas. He did everything in a big way. He slung the bag over his shoulder and started off to see the king, no less. The king was in his throne room just killing time when his sergeant-at-arms came in. "Yes," said the king, "what is it?" "Cat to see you," said the sergeant-at-arms. "A cat? A cat? Well, I'll be a monkey's uncle," the king said. "Show this cat in." The sergeant gave a signal. A door opened. There was a fanfare. And in marched Puss, a fine figure of a cat in his shiny new boots. He laid the rabbit he had caught at the king's feet and made a low bow and said, "O king, live forever." "Thanks," said the king, "but what have we here?" "I have brought you, sire, a rabbit," said Puss, "with the compliments of my master, the noble Marquis of Carabas." Now, there was no such person as the Marquis of Carabas. That was just a name Puss made up for his master because he thought it sounded grand. But the king was very pleased, and when Puss came the next day with a present of some partridges that he had bagged, the king began to think this Marquis of Carabas must be a pretty fine fellow and a good man to know. Yeah. By the way, you better go turn over the record. I'll wait. One day when Puss knew that the king was going for a drive along the river with his daughter, who incidentally was the most beautiful princess in the world, he went running to his master and said, "Master, this is your big chance. Go jump in the river." His poor master was feeling pretty low about then and had half a mind to jump in the river anyway, so he did as he was told. Puss hid his clothes under a rock. When the royal coach came driving by, the cat began to whoop and holler, "Oh, man overboard! Help, help! The Marquis of Carabas is drowning!" Immediately the king cried, "Halt!" and he ordered his guards to go to the rescue of the Marquis. While they were pulling the poor fellow out of the river, Puss told the king that some burglars had stolen his master's clothes while he was in swimming, so he had nothing to wear. "A fine thing," said the king, and he sent for one of his own best suits for the Marquis. Now, the miller's son may have been no Marquis, but he was a good-looking young fellow, and when he got into the king's clothes, he was so doggone handsome, the princess fell head over heels in love with him. "You know, Papa," she said, "I think it would be nice if we invited the Marquis to ride in our coach with us." "By all means," said the king. "Shove over." So the miller's son climbed in, and the coach started gaily off again, and ahead of it went Puss, strutting along in his fine new boots. It was really a glorious day. The king enjoyed looking at the countryside, and the princess and the Marquis enjoyed looking at each other. Puss ran on ahead, and presently he came to a beautiful big meadow which some farmers were mowing. Puss swaggered up to one of the men and pretended to be very tough. "Who's in charge here?" he demanded. The man replied, "I am." Puss looked him in the eye. "Well, listen, bub," he said. "I'm telling you this for your own good. The king is coming by here in a minute, and when he does, you tell him that this meadow belongs to the Marquis of Carabas. Because if you don't," he said, "I'll have your heads chopped off. All of you." The The farmer said, "Yes, sir." And when the king came along and inquired who owned that fine meadow, the farmers all said, "The Marquis of Carabas, yes, sir." A little farther along, they came to a rich cornfield that stretched as far as the eye could see. And there were reapers by the roadside harvesting the corn. But Puss got there first, and he told the men, "If you don't tell the king that this cornfield belongs to the Marquis of Carabas, I'll see to it personally that you're all chopped up as fine as mincemeat." So when the king leaned out of his coach and asked the men, "Who owns all this?" they replied at once, "The Marquis of Carabas, lock, stock, and barrel." And the king was much impressed. Puss was well ahead of him by this time, and he came at last to a stately castle which belonged to a rich retired ogre. He owned all the land for miles around, and people lived in terror of him. But do you think Puss was afraid? Huh? If you want to find out, go change the record while I light a cigar. Let's see now. Where were we? Oh, yes. At the ogre's castle. Puss didn't like this part of it, but he walked up to the castle and rapped bravely on the door, and a mighty voice inside bellowed, "Who's there?" But when the ogre opened the door and saw that it was only a cat with boots on, he laughed. Did you ever hear an ogre laugh? Yeah. "Come on in," he said. "Come on in and sit down. What do you know? What's new?" Well, they talked about one thing and another. How the country was going to pot, and with taxes so high a man could hardly make both ends meet. And finally Puss said slyly, "You know, I heard something about you." "What did you hear about me?" the ogre asked. "Oh, it probably isn't true," Puss said. "You know how these stories get around. But I heard you were so powerful that you could change yourself into any kind of animal you want to. Of course, I don't believe it." "You don't believe it, eh?" said the ogre. "Stand back." And all of a sudden, he was a roaring lion. Puss was so frightened he jumped right out of his boots. "I believe you," he cried. "Nice lion, nice lion." The lion laughed, and in a flash he was only an ogre again. "That's not a bad trick," Puss admitted. "Not bad," the ogre said. "I'd like to see anybody else do it." "Well," Puss said, "if you wanted to do a real trick." "No, but you couldn't do it." "I couldn't do what?" the ogre asked. "No, you couldn't do this," Puss said. "Listen," the ogre replied. "You name it and I'll do it." "All right," said Puss. "I'll bet you my boots you can't change yourself into an animal as small as a rat." "A rat?" the ogre said. "That's nothing. You watch and I'll turn myself into a mouse." And by George, he did. He turned into a mouse and ran around the floor squealing. That was just what Puss was waiting for. He sprang at the mouse and caught him and gobbled him up. And that was the end of the ogre. Well, when the king and the princess and Puss's master came driving up to the castle, Puss ran out to greet them. "Welcome," he cried. "Welcome to the castle of the Marquis of Carabas." "What?" said the king. "Does this fine castle belong to the Marquis too?" The king got out of the coach and looked about him. As pretty a piece of property as I ever saw, he thought. And to the miller's son, he said, "My lord Marquis, if you don't marry my daughter, and right away, it'll be your own fault." That was all the Marquis needed. The princess and he were married that very same day, and they lived happily ever after. And as for Puss, he became a great lord, and never chased mice anymore, except now and then for fun.